Okay, good evening. I hope that we're live. My name is Ben Jamal. I'm the director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and I'm speaking to you from London. Welcome to you from wherever you are joining us across the world. This event is being live streamed on Facebook by PSC, by our friends at Jewish Voice for Peace on their Facebook page, and by Human Rights Watch on their Facebook page. It's the third in a series of events taking place as part of the campaign, Facebook, We Need to Talk. And you can find out in the links on PSC's Facebook page, you'll see their links to previous talks, the first one hosted by our friends at JVP, and the second by our friends at Hamler. Now I'm going to be joined for the conversation we're going to have this evening by two eminent and respected human rights advocates and campaigners. Firstly, by Omar Shakir. Omar is the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, and in that capacity, he investigates rights abuses within the state of Israel and committed within the occupied Palestinian territory. And we're also joined by Rivka Barnard. Rivka is the head of civic space at War and Want here in the UK, where she has responsibility in that role for monitoring and addressing attempts to suppress legitimate human rights campaigning, particularly in relation to Palestine. So we're going to talk about the Facebook campaign, what it is about, and how we should understand what Facebook is contemplating in the context of wider attempts to delegitimize and suppress activism for the rights of the Palestinian people. We're going to look at this particularly this evening through the lens of how what Facebook is planning to do risk disabling people's ability to hold the government of Israel to account for its violations of international law and its abuses of human rights. Let's be clear, first of all, just briefly about what it is that Facebook is considering. The Israeli government and some of its supporters are asking Facebook to add Zionist and Zionism as protected categories in its hate speech policy. That is to treat Zionist effectively as a proxy for Jew or Jewish. And this means that if you were, for example, to post something on Facebook that was negative in relation to Zionism or spoke negatively about Zionists, then that could be interpreted as hate speech and removed. So let's start to interrogate that. And let me ask, first of all, and I think, Omar, if I turn to you, first of all, how do you understand what Facebook are proposing to do, and why should we be concerned about it?
Thanks, Ben, so much for having us, and to PSC and for all of you for tuning in on a Thursday afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you happen to be. So I think it's important to sort of start by understanding that there have long been concerns about free speech on Facebook, and in particular in relation to Israel-Palestine. And there have been different maneuvers or steps taken by Facebook with different justifications. Just to give one example that's different from what Ben outlined in the beginning, Human Rights Watch in 2019 documented the way in which Facebook has taken down content that it determines to be incitement or to be supporting terrorist activity. And we explained how Facebook relies on the US State Department terrorism designation, which includes Palestinian political movements that have armed wings, like the PFLP and Hamas, and how this stunts discussion of political developments by Palestinians. But what we're discussing today, as Ben laid out, is a very specific new policy that's under consideration by Facebook. In particular, Facebook is looking at something relating to its hate speech policy. So Facebook has a current hate speech policy that defines hate speech as a direct attack against people on the basis of what we call protected characteristics. They define protected characteristics to include race, ethnicity, national origin, religious affiliation, among many others. And one thing they clarify in that policy is they don't just look at the use of race directly, but the use of proxies or substitute words, for those categories. So under that policy, Facebook takes down posts that it considers to be anti-Semitic. And as part of that policy, it will also today take down posts that uses the word Zionist as a substitute for Jewish, and when that's hate speech. So already today, before even discussing this new change, there is a hate speech policy that will take down some posts mentioning Zionist when it's used as a proxy for Jewish and is part of what they determine to be hate speech. So what Facebook is currently looking to do is something different. What it's currently looking to do is to expand that policy and use the word Zionist in a more broad way to restrict speech. And so for us at Human Rights Watch, our concern is not so much what the right definition of Zionist or Zionism is, or what the history is or what the politics are. For us, our concern is always the human rights issues. And there are two different human rights issues here, to be very clear. There are protection of vulnerable communities, and there is free speech. And in this case, those objectives are at odds. But our particular concern, Ben, with this policy is that in relying too much on a single word, in this particular case, it risks restricting legitimate political conversation, right? And we have this concern not just about Zionists, we have this concern about any other word with an automated system and the need to look holistically at content. But when it comes to this specific context, while there certainly are cases, undeniably, where Zionist can be used as a proxy for Jewish and be used in hate speech, the concern is there's no way to implement this policy in a way that does not include discriminatory censorship. And I'll just briefly sort of explain why that's the case. It's because invariably that's going to involve limiting legitimate conversation about Israeli human rights abuse. Palestinians often use Zionist as a term to describe their experiences living under occupation, under discrimination, under rights abuse. And I think it's particularly important to note in Arabic how this term is used, because in many cases, Zionist is used in Arabic to refer to those people carrying out the rights abuse or those abusive policies. In fact, there has been some movement among Arabic speakers to use Zionist in place of the more common in colloquial Arabic, Jew or Jewish, in describing the people carrying out abuse. So in some ways, this policy risks actually restricting speech undertaken in a nuanced way to avoid actually using a word like Jewish as a stand-in for Israeli. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'm eager to hear Rivka's thoughts as well.
Yeah, so Rivka, if you want to add, and again, the same question, why is this of concern?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for hosting this event and for having me, and thanks, Omar, for setting out the frame so nicely. And I would say that we share the concerns, firstly, about how this might impact Palestinians' rights and abilities to speak on social media about their experiences, and how it might impact other people's rights and abilities to hear from Palestinians, to learn more, to be able to discuss and debate Zionism, just like any other political movement should be and would be discussed. And I'm not suggesting that Facebook is the only or even the best pedagogical environment. I'm not saying that all of our learning about Zionism should happen on Facebook, on the contrary, but Facebook is a space for discussion in its very nature. So I think it's important for us to look at that as a place where a lot of speech is happening. And lastly, I would say we have a concern about putting the power and responsibility onto a private company to decide what's appropriate speech and what's not. And I say power and responsibility very pointedly. Power because it grants a huge amount of power and discretion to a profit-making body, but responsibility of individual moderators, the people who would be responsible for making decisions about this. And I think Omar's described really clearly, this is not, these situations that are already coming up or would be coming up aren't going to be easy calls to make, right? It takes a lot of nuance to understand the fuller conversation, the context, and it would make, I think, a lot of people, a lot of potentially unwilling people, complicit in a level of censorship that's just mind-boggling. It would be a very murky area, even with the best intentions. And I don't know how people could be briefed for that task of identifying what is abusive and what's not. And we know from other circumstances that it has the potential to go really, really wrong. And I know that Facebook has been sort of forced to consider the issue of their employees who are responsible for moderation. And I would say that this would not be an easier task than the other ones that they have.
Yeah, thank you both. And I think that's a useful sort of context to start with. And picking up the important point, this is not about saying that it is inconceivable that there can be situations where Zionists could be used as a proxy for Jew or Jewish in a way, where someone is trying to say something anti-Semitic and is simply substituting the word Zionist for Jewish, but using anti-Semitic tropes, for example. The concern is about the potential suppression of legitimate conversation about Israeli human rights abuses and the rights of the Palestinian people. So maybe if we try to drill down on that a little bit. And Rivka, if I come to you first of all, can you give us a sense of what are the types of events, the types of speech that you think may be threatened or are likely to be threatened by this change? Can you give concrete examples of the sort of things that you think would be disabled? And how this would impact on the ability of civil society groups like yours and others to hold the Israeli government to account?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's in some ways it's hard for us to think or to talk about specific examples, though it was helpful to hear from you, Amar, about the things that are already happening. I think that's a good sort of indicator of what we could expect if this policy was expanded. But I think what's really at risk here is that sort of wide and open discussion of Zionism and of what Palestinians have experienced in the past and what they're experiencing now. So it may be less about specific events being blocked off, though that is also an issue, but more about the impact that this could have on the speech space necessary to do accountability work. So if I can say just something about what, at least for us at Where I'm Want, what that accountability work looks like. Obviously, some of the sort of formal processes for holding Israel to account for its abuses of Palestinian rights, those formal processes are really behind where they should be. And that's why the abuses continue, right? There's wide scale impunity for Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. And of course, it's not just me saying this, it comes straight from the UN human rights experts who have been raising the issue of impunity over and over. So we have decades of systematic abuses of Palestinian rights kind of piling up, and the harm expands exponentially, I would say, each year that we don't have accountability enacted. Now, there are recent developments with, let's say, the International Criminal Court and the UN Human Rights Council's database on companies complicit in the settlement project. And that's shown some sort of positive movement towards accountability. But in parallel, and potentially much more powerfully, grassroots movements like the BDS movement have been showing, I think, how people power, how nonviolent and grassroots bottom-up organizing can force the issue of accountability, first by centering Palestinian rights, Palestinian grievances, the evidence that Palestinians are presenting, the sort of testimony about violations of their rights, and secondly, by identifying and pressuring companies or government that's been complicit. That movement for accountability, and all social movements, all movements for accountability, really relies on and necessitates two main things. First and foremost is the ability of victims of crime to speak about what they've experienced, and then the ability of people to study, discuss, debate the best ways to create pathways for justice. I think that's a principle of what accountability work is. For me, you know, when I'm thinking about this particular issue, the discussion of Zionism is key to this, because it's the core element of settler colonialism. And it was the Zionist movement that engaged in the colonization of Palestine in the early 20th century. And those are the terms that it used, those are the terms of the Zionist movement, colonization. And now the state of Israel, which of course is the product of that movement, continues to enact and expand that settler project. So we need an open discussion about Zionism to get to the heart of matter and to kind of get to accountability. I would say, like in an academic setting, if you tried to write a paper on what's happening in Palestine and you didn't mention Zionism, or Zionists, you would fail that class, right? There's no matter what your political outlook is, you have to have that discussion of Zionism to talk about accountability. So that discussion is paramount and so significant to making sure that Palestinians can access justice. And if Facebook were to close off its space for that crucial discussion, I think it would be a major block on that process. And I would worry about how it would ripple out to other spaces too. If people see that they can't discuss Zionism on Facebook, maybe they are going to feel like they can't discuss it in their university as well. So I think that ripple effect of what this could mean is really, really dangerous.
Yeah, and the points Rivka's making speak to to what we constantly refer to as the chilling effect, which I think is something that we can return to when we look at the sort of this in the broader frame of attempts to delegitimize action for Palestine. But Omar, do you want to say something about, from Human Rights Watch perspective, if this change were made, concretely again, how is that going to disable Human Rights Watch from its work in identifying and challenging human rights abuses being committed by the State of Israel?
Sure. Well, I think let me give a couple of really concrete examples of the kinds of speech that could be taken down, and not just by Human Rights Watch's use, but everyday people, which I think is really the concern. So let's take the statement, Zionists are criminals, like that statement, right? You can imagine how a Facebook censor might say, hey, imagine if that was Jews are criminals, that could be problematic. But let me give you a paragraph where you would see that it's legitimate speech. You could say, look, Zionist leaders are building settlements in the occupied West Bank. The Fourth Geneva Convention defines transfer of civilian population as a war crime. Thereby, Zionists are criminals, right? Like, so, that sentence, there without context, could be taken down, even though it could be used in legitimate speech about human rights abuse. Just to give you an example, just a week ago, just in the last week, you had Prime Minister Netanyahu call the International Criminal Court's ruling, about jurisdiction over the state of Palestine anti-Semitic. So you can again imagine the ways in which that argument could then be interpreted as being anti-Semitic. Let me take another example. One common type of hate speech involves conspiracy theories or involves historical tropes, right? So you asked about Human Rights Watch, when we documented Israel's firing on protesters in Gaza in 2018 and 2019 and argued that those amounted to war crimes, one of the arguments used against us by supporters of the Israeli government was that was a blood libel. Right. And of course, using a blood libel would be a textbook, if it was actually a blood libel, anti-Semitism. So again, you can imagine how somebody who is engaging in criticism of particular policies could very much inadvertently, by criticizing the Israeli government policies, find themselves being accused of using Zionists as a proxy. And I want to just sort of emphasize that point again to maybe some of our audience. Maybe if you're an American, if you're in the UK, maybe you wouldn't think to use Zionist for Israeli. That sort of doesn't make sense. Maybe it seems ideological, but that's very different in different parts of the world. And my concern with this policy, and I think Rivka said it really well, is even for the most sophisticated person who speaks about Israel-Palestine, it's a minefield, right? And inadvertently, you could find yourself being accused of this sort of thing. Just to give you an example, let's take a perfectly legitimate statement. If you were to say the Israel lobby has outsized influence in the US, or you said Zionist lobby, I think all of us could agree that's legitimate, conversation, right? But of course, you could again be accused of playing into a historical trope involving Jewish people in power. In fact, US Congress people like Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan Omar have been accused of falling in that trap. So if that's the case for people in the US Congress, if that's the criticisms that Human Rights Watch are getting, imagine the average person who's sitting in Nablus wanting to criticize the abuses they see around them every day, and how easy it is for their routine everyday speech to therefore be considered if they use the word Zionist in that kind of way. The Zionist lobby has outside influence, or Zionists are committing crimes, being then leading to accusations that it's anti-Semitic. That's really the heart of the concern.
Yeah, and I'm conscious in what Rivka said about the concerns in relation to a private company, and then when you examine the mechanics of somebody sat somewhere trying to assess how do I categorize these particular concrete statements of the types that Omar you've outlined. One thing that's coming to my mind, and this takes us, I think, to the terrain of looking at this in the broader context of delegitimizing activism for Palestine. There was a situation in the UK a couple of years ago where a bicycle ride raising money for children in Gaza, but also seeking to draw attention to the oppression of the Palestinian people, was denied permission to finish in a park run by a council in London. And when we interrogated the decision, because the rationale given for disallowing it didn't make sense, when PSC obtained freedom of information about what lay behind the decision, it took us to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and a council official, not really in our interpretation of the email exchanges from any malevolent intent, looked at references to ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948 that were on the website of the organization organizing the bike ride, looked at references that described the oppression of the Palestinian people are suffering at the moment as meeting the legal definition of apartheid, and said these might be anti-Semitic in terms of my understanding of the IHRA definition. So there we had a situation where somebody is saying, tasked with the job of, are there any concerns about this event, going to a particular definition of anti-Semitism and reaching that conclusion. So that speaks a little bit, I think, about somewhere I'd like to take the conversation, which is understanding what Facebook is doing in the context of broader attempts to delegitimize activism for Palestine. This is something I can say from PSC's perspective, we've of necessity had to address as an increasingly significant part of our work in order to protect the space for campaigning. The way we understand this is a very overt and evidence process being engineered by Israel with support of allies to delegitimize activism, to reframe it as something hostile, bigoted, and anti-Semitic, and by doing so to separate Palestine solidarity from other progressive movements, to confine campaigning for Palestinian human rights to the margins of political discourse. Now, part of that involves the conflation of attempts to hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law and human rights with anti-Semitism. If I come to you first of all, Omar, can you give us examples of how you have witnessed or experienced that broader attempt to delegitimize holding Israel to account within your work?
Absolutely, Ben. I think you put your finger on the right issue. I think part of why this potential policy change is concerning is the larger context. And let's be very clear, there is a global, effort to delegitimize and stymie work critical of Israeli government policies. And this affects Israelis, Palestinians, and people around the world, inside Israel, but also outside of Israel. So it takes many different forms. I think it starts with smears of different groups. It applies to Israelis, including Jewish Israeli human rights groups that have been accused of being traitors or collaborators. It's much worse for Palestinian human rights defenders who face accusations of being violent or supporting terrorism. And for internationals, the form of smear is often anti-Semitism or support for boycotts, which has been linked to being one and the same in recent years. And that's not just a smear, right? If you look at what's happening over in recent years, you see the smear is leading to actual censorship efforts to muzzle human rights advocates. Let's start with looking at the picture inside Israel. Inside Israel, Israeli civil society organizations have faced laws now that restrict their ability to receive foreign funding. For Palestinian human rights defenders, they have faced raids on their office, such as the army raiding the office of the Palestinian prisoner rights group Adlamir. They include travel bans. Just today, Amnesty International filed a lawsuit against the Israeli government because their campaigner, Laith Abu Ziad, is facing a punitive travel ban for unspecified security reasons. 18 months, he wasn't able to be with his mother as she battled and eventually succumbed to cancer 3 kilometers from his home because of this travel ban. We've seen arrests of Palestinian human rights defenders, including Khalid Jarrar, who's being held without trial or charge well into her 2nd year. We see even efforts to deport residents of Jerusalem like Salah Hamouri. And we see the use of boycotts and the way the Israeli government has fought the BDS movement. Just to give you a brief perspective on the fight against boycott, in 2011, the Israeli government passed a law allowing civil lawsuits to be filed against supporters of boycotts, where they can show that that call led to damages to Israelis. Then in 2017, Israel amended its law of entry to deny entry to those who call for boycotts, literally a political litmus test on entry. Then in 2019, who, again, Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, one of the world's largest human rights organization, was deported by the Israeli government after spending 2.5 years on the ground. And we challenged this all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court. I was forced out because ultimately the government accused us of calling for boycotts, and they based it in part on the work Human Rights Watch did looking at corporate human rights abuses by operating in settlements. And Human Rights Watch, by the way, takes no position on boycotts. So you went from civil actions, denying entry to BDS supporters, then deporting a Human Rights Watch official whose organization takes no position on boycotts. And then what we saw just last year is the US government then say that the BDS movement is inherently anti-Semitic. And there were even press reports out that Human Rights Watch is being considered, among other groups like Amnesty and Oxfam, to be listed on a list of organizations that are anti-Semitic. The Trump administration didn't get around to publishing that list, but we've already seen the Biden administration, including its UN ambassador, in a hearing in front of the US Senate, claim that BDS borders on anti-Semitism, right? A tactic used around the world, support for boycotts to promote and fight against human rights abuses. So again, when you look at Facebook's decision, and that's not even to mention, that's just the United States, right? I mean, if you look at France, where Macron has said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, Germany, which has passed a resolution that condemns, the BDS resolution. And if you look at you mentioned, I think, Ben, the IHRA definition, this definition of anti-Semitism getting momentum around the world, which includes among its examples of what's anti-Semitic. I'll just give you 2 examples. One is claiming the existence of a state of Israel as a racist endeavor. That may have been the issue that you referenced there. And another one is applying double standards by requiring behavior not expected or demanded of other democratic nations. So again, when you look at Facebook's decision in that context, you see why we at Human Rights Watch and Warren Want, I think many other groups, are deeply concerned about the direction Facebook is moving.
Yeah, and just in reference to one of the laws that that you referenced, the so-called anti-BDS law, PSC's former chair and current chair are 2 of the people who have been denied entry on the basis of that law. Our current chair, who is Palestinian, was separated from his family at the border. Rivka, this is a huge amount of your daily work, isn't it? Addressing this and the attempts to suppress the ability of a global civil society to hold Israel to account. Do you want to describe some of the issues that you've confronted, that you've identified and had to tackle?
Sure. Yeah, I think the examples that Omar gave are really important examples, and they show some of that broader context. I mean, I think it's ironic that Facebook is looking at this issue as a part of its sort of attempt to address disinformation, right? It's looking at a broader picture, and of course, disinformation is a topic that all of us are talking about much more than we were before. But by doing this, by expanding this policy as they're considering, it could inadvertently advance disinformation campaigns that are aimed at silencing Palestinians. So we're witnessing, and I think again Omar described it, really concerted efforts by the Israeli government, by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in the Israeli government, which sort of publishes these inflammatory reports that have been recognized even by the EU as disinformation, and other aligned groups also. to propagate disinformation against about Palestinian human rights defenders. And the aim of those attacks is to smear them, to disrupt their crucial human rights work, sometimes life-saving humanitarian work also. And the goal is to isolate Palestinians, to cut off their resources, to cut off their contact. If we're talking about Palestinians inside occupied Palestine, to cut off their contact with people outside, and to keep them from being able to access those accountability mechanisms. And of course, the same tactics are being used, or similar tactics, let's say, to target organizations outside of Palestine, including all of ours on this call, and many individuals too, again, including all of us here, I think, which is really devastating. We wouldn't want Facebook, I'm sure people at Facebook wouldn't want to be playing into that wider effort either. The other thing I want to say about this, just about that issue of the objective, I think the aim of those attempts to suppress, to silence Palestinians and to suppress solidarity, liberation struggles and struggles for justice and anti-colonial movements around the world and throughout history have often gained strength from connection with others. And Palestinians have built this sort of international network of support and solidarity really brilliantly over decades. I mean, that's a huge legacy of work that's been put in for the Palestinian liberation movement is massively internationalist. It's always been interested in connecting with other progressive movements. So these attempts to crack down and to silence and to smear and punish solidarity are really about breaking that down and isolating Palestinians. So again, I mean, it's really ironic that Facebook would potentially play a part in that. It's supposed to be all about connecting people around the world, and these added restrictions, if Facebook were to adopt them, would make Facebook an accessory to those wider efforts, I think, to isolate a people that needs support now more than ever before.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to take the discussion to an even broader domain. And I think one of the challenges that we faced, and I would say particularly in a UK context, is how do we involve a broader coalition of organisations in addressing these concerns and seeing them as fundamental civil rights issues. And that's become particularly challenging when, particularly in those circumstances when the issue at hand is that the way the space has been closed down is through narratives of anti-Semitism. And that creates a chilling effect that makes people very reluctant to come into this arena. But if I put the question this way, to those maybe who are listening to this who say, well, I'm not involved, I'm not a campaigner on Palestine. I understand your concerns, but why is this of concern to me? So how does this speak to a broader concern about the violation of fundamental democratic rights that should be of concern to us, whatever government or whatever rights abuses we're wanting to address? Should I come, Omar? Do you want to address that first of all? Why should everybody be concerned and be getting involved in this campaign?
Sure, I think everyone should care because this tactic that Israeli government officials and their supporters use to escape human rights scrutiny is not unique to them. Human Rights Watch works in 100 countries across the world, and in many places, abusive governments use very similar arguments regarding bias or discriminatory to shift the conversation, because instead of focusing on your substantive critique, you end up dealing with these arguments that you're biased. I mean, I can say I've personally been denied entry to 2 other countries in the Middle East because of my work at Human Rights Watch, Bahrain and Egypt. And before that, Syria, before I was with Human Rights Watch. But let me give you a few very concrete examples, right? Imagine Saudi Arabia saying, well, Human Rights Watch, your work on guardianship of women or on women driving, that's Islamophobic, right? So we're not going to sort of permit that discussion to happen. Or imagine, criticisms coming from Egypt, Sudan, or in other parts of Africa where FGM or female genital mutilation is practicing. Look, that's just, they don't, misunderstanding, anti-African, anti-Sudanese, anti-Egyptian, not understanding our culture. Or imagine in Nigeria, where we've documented repression of LGBTQ peoples. If, again, folks there were to say this is anti-Nigerian or anti-African. Or imagine in China, if the folks were to say your work on Tibet or on Uyghurs is anti-Chinese racism, right? And in this case, it's even more insidious because we're talking about Zionists, we're talking about Zionism, we're talking about an ideology. We're not talking about even a nationality, right? We're talking about an ideology. So imagine again, if a country were to say, well, you can't use Islamist because that's a proxy for Islamophobia, or you can't use Hindu nationalist because that's a proxy for Hindu, or white nationalist, or Afrikaner in South Africa. I mean, you can go down the list of ideologies, right? Communist. I mean, if you just kind of keep going down and thinking about the precedent this sets. So I think the reason you worry about this is because if you make an exception here, you sort of open the door then for similar ways for Facebook to restrict speech. And I think Rivka put it really well in the beginning. I mean, this is where so much of the conversation is taking place across the world. It's online, and it's not just because of COVID and Zoom. I mean, going back years and even longer than that. So I think that's really where our concern would come.
And Rivka, I don't know what you want to add to that. I've had the pleasure of witnessing you being a key part in trying to build these coalitions in the UK and speaking to organisations that are not involved in Palestine solidarity, but saying this matters to you as well. Do you want to add your thoughts to what Omar said?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it sort of echoes some of the same ideas. And I can just give you an example that I was having a conversation with some sort of War on Want elders, people that have been involved in War on Want for a long time yesterday. And, I was talking about the issues that we've faced, and they said, yeah, we remember that kind of stuff from War on Want's days fighting apartheid in South Africa. There were similar kinds of campaigns to smear people that were opposed to apartheid, obviously in South Africa, but also externally. Also, we get some sort of trolling and hatred also over the work we do in support of the Sahrawi people's rights. So there's, this issue, first of all, this kind of repression, this kind of shutting down of space is not unique, but what's unique in some ways about this moment and about this particular sort of lever, I would say, in Facebook, is that at this point in time, Israel is really perfecting these techniques of smearing solidarity, of throwing weight around to shut down conversation. And I think another conversation I was having the other day with a friend of mine who's an Indian journalist, who was saying, yeah, look at the alliances that Israel has right now with some of the most repressive regimes in the world, India, the United Arab Emirates. And I know the issue of the Emirates and the kind of censorship that's going on there in relation to Facebook has come up in other conversations, especially with people in the Arab world talking about these issues. So I think Israel is perfecting the technique and already exporting it in terms of actual technology, spyware and things like that, but also how to use disinformation to sort of shut down a movement. So again, I think there's a real risk for Facebook or for other people to ignore this, because this is going to start rippling out, certainly, and it already is. We know that it already is. And I would say just for other progressive movements, when we're trying to sort of build coalitions around this, again, it's like, if you're interested in human rights at all, anywhere, if you're interested and care about digital rights, which are a really important part of human rights, we know that now, 10 years ago, I don't think people used the term digital rights in the same way, but we know that that's a key part of human rights. So this issue is for everyone. And I think, I hope, I'm sure that, Ben, you'll have some suggestions of what people can do also to sort of express their care and concern about this.
Thank you, and that's a good place to sort of draw to a conclusion, but I want to give you both an opportunity, if there's anything you've not had a chance to say, but also picking up Rivka's cue, we're holding these events as part of awareness raising, of alerting people to the concern and to the danger and to the risk, and we're calling for action. So if there's anything you want to say in conclusion, but maybe in particular, what would you say to people who are watching this, who might be saying, well, what can I do about this? What would you say to them? Omar, do you want to start and then Rivka? Okay.
Sure. I would say, look, I think Rivka put it well in the beginning. Social media platforms and free speech issues are so important. Digital rights are a really important frontier. It's certainly something Human Rights Watch is looking more and more at. It's increasingly where people turn for information. And it's important to see this policy change in the context of really a systematic assault, not only on human rights advocacy around Israel-Palestine, but on basic criticism. And I think the message here needs to be not only to defend the space, because I think that's incredibly important, and those that are concerned about these issues, without the space to have this conversation, we can't change the reality on the ground. But I also want to sort of say really critically is people shouldn't leave here feeling like, oh, what can I say on Facebook anymore? Like, this sounds really scary. Can I not post? Can I not retweet or reshare this even event without getting in trouble for it? I really want people to sort of to realize that part of our work, and especially those of us that have platforms and privilege, and if you're tuning in, you have internet, is to be able to mainstream this. And the more that we all speak out in principled ways and continue to share and talk about these issues, the more it becomes mainstreamed, and the easier it becomes then for people who live under occupation, for people who face systematic repression every day, to be able to know that they can express themselves freely. Because if all of us are sharing and amplifying and raising our voices, then that makes it easier for people who live in more difficult circumstances to do so. So I guess my message is really defend this space. But the biggest thing you can do is continue to use, your Facebook and Twitter to share news, to share human rights abuses, to share things you care and are passionate about.
And Rivka, over to you for your concluding remarks.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and it's been a really useful discussion, I think, we've had today. And I think that context, that larger context, is a really important piece of this. And it feels like this is an opportunity also that, Facebook has not implemented this new expanded policy yet. So it's an opportunity to actually intervene in that conversation. And it's been really, really interesting looking at the other conversations that are a part of this series. And I think it's, it shows how actually to transform that space of potential repression, already existing repression and potential repression, into a way to talk about the issues and to make it a sort of educational space and conversation. And that's what, free society is supposed to be all about, right? So I think it's really important to keep the conversation going, to keep also, again, as Omar said, defending the space, and also doing what we can to support the people who are really struggling to get their voices out, to do that. So not only to talk about the repression that we're facing, but also to help elevate the voices, especially of Palestinian human rights defenders who are speaking, who are doing amazing work documenting human rights abuses and promoting their rights. We have to sort of find all the platforms possible to be able to hear from them. Facebook is one of them, but we want to sort of make sure that the conversation happens everywhere too. So I think I would end on that.
Okay, well, listen, it just remains for me, first of all, to really thank Rivka and Omar, both for their contributions this evening, but for the extraordinary work I know they both do in defending human rights. And I want to say this in conclusion, and maybe let me conclude with a direct experience that I think it's pertinent to share. And I talked earlier about the situation of a London council that stopped a bicycle ride taking place, and PSC, amongst other groups, challenged that decision. And I ended up personally sitting in the room with the mayor of that council who had made that decision. And I'll say to you now what I said to him. I decided to tell him something of my personal story, and I said to him, I am the grandson of a Palestinian man called Shukri Jamal and a Palestinian woman called Nazli Jamal. And Nazli and Shukri, amongst over 700,000 other Palestinians, were forced to flee from their home in 1948. And they were never allowed the right to return. They died in exile. Now, what I said to the mayor was, look, if I'm going to challenge that history of injustice and that ongoing injustice, then I need to describe that history accurately, and I need to describe it in the way it was described on the Bicycle Rides website. I need to describe it as an act of ethnic cleansing. And because my grandparents were driven from their home before the formation of the State of Israel, I need to describe it accurately as an act carried out by Zionist militias. And I asked the mayor, do you think you've heard an anti-Semitic statement? And he said, no, of course I haven't. I said, well, here's the problem, because your council officials are not so certain. And if Facebook is not so certain, then everything you've just heard me say might be regarded as a violation of their community standards, and if I were to post it on Facebook, might be removed. And events like tonight, where we discuss these issues, might be banned. And I would agree with what Omar and Rivka said earlier, that once you remove people's ability to bring the facts of their oppression into the public domain, the rights of others to discuss those facts and to call for action to address injustice, then you remove the glue that is essential to the functioning of a democracy. And at a time where respect for the rule of law, for rights, for the safeguarding as well of what is factual and true, as opposed to what is opinion, is under threat like never before. This matters, and it matters hugely to every single one of us. So please, in conclusion, sign the petition. I think we've now reached 50,000. We want to go further. Sign the petition. Wherever you are watching this, also get involved in the campaign for Palestinian rights that exists in your area. Thank you for being with us tonight. Stay safe. Thank you.